The restaurant's new waitress. Emily had only been working at Bistro Haven for a few weeks, but she had already earned a reputation. The other waitstaff knew her as the one who would serve people well if she liked them, and make them miserable if she didn't. She was young, energetic, and dressed sharply in her black uniform, ready to make tips and keep things moving. But if a customer seemed to annoy her, Emily's attitude would turn sour in a flash. It was a chilly morning, and the restaurant was slowly filling up with its regulars. Bistro Haven was a cozy place with warm lighting, soft music, and big windows overlooking the busy city streets. People loved coming here for a relaxing meal, catching up with friends, or enjoying a bit of peace over coffee. Emily liked it too, though more for the money she made than for the atmosphere or the people. As she walked around, taking orders and giving quick, polite smiles, a figure appeared at the door. Emily noticed her immediately. An elderly woman stood there, wrapped in a light coat, her face soft with age, but showing kindness in her eyes. She took a slow step inside, glancing around the restaurant, as if looking for someone or something in particular. Emily's polite smile faded. "Oh, great," she muttered under her breath. She had no patience for high-maintenance customers, and she assumed that older folks usually had all sorts of little requests, from needing a seat in a particular spot to wanting everything served just so. As the elderly woman walked up to the hostess stand, Emily hurried over, putting on a forced smile. "Welcome to Bistro Haven. How many people are you waiting for?" The woman's voice was soft but steady. "Just one, dear. I'd love a table by the window, if that's all right." Emily sighed internally but kept her expression neutral. "Actually, the tables by the window are reserved right now," she lied smoothly. In reality, there were 2 tables by the window that were free, but Emily just didn't want to cater to any special requests. She guided the woman to a smaller, less comfortable spot closer to the entrance. The woman took her seat without complaint, settling into the chair with a slight smile, thanking Emily quietly. Emily barely acknowledged her and quickly handed her a menu, muttering, "Here you go. I'll give you a few minutes to decide." She didn't bother asking if the woman wanted water or anything else right away. Emily moved back to the counter, rolling her eyes as she walked. She mumbled to one of her coworkers, "These old people think they own the place. It's like they come in here just to be fussy." Her coworker gave her a raised eyebrow, looking a bit uncomfortable but saying nothing. Back at her table, the elderly woman quietly studied the menu, occasionally glancing out the window. She didn't look like she had noticed or been offended by Emily's rude behavior. In fact, she seemed quite content, as though she had all the time in the world. After a few minutes, Emily returned, an impatient look crossing her face. "Are you ready to order yet?" she asked, tapping her pen on her notepad. The woman looked up, smiling politely. "Yes, dear," she said. "I'll have the vegetable soup and a small salad, please. And could you make sure the soup isn't too hot? My mouth is sensitive to very hot food." Emily almost rolled her eyes again, but stopped herself. She scribbled down the order quickly, muttering, "Sure, I'll let the kitchen know." As she walked away, she shook her head, thinking how picky some people could be. In the kitchen, she handed the order slip to the chef, muttering, "Table by the door. Wants her soup not too hot." She added a little sarcastic tone, not caring who heard her. Emily felt her time was wasted on requests that, to her, seemed silly. She returned to her other tables, refilling coffee cups and bringing out plates with practiced ease. But each time she glanced over at the elderly woman's table, she felt slightly annoyed. The woman's quiet presence bothered her, though she couldn't quite explain why. When the soup and salad were ready, Emily grabbed the tray and carried it out, setting the bowl and plate down in front of the elderly woman with a quick, "Here's your food." She didn't ask if the woman needed anything else or if everything looked all right. Instead, she turned and walked away, not noticing the slight smile of gratitude on the woman's face as she quietly began her meal. Emily continued to watch from a distance, her mind busy with her own thoughts, still feeling annoyed that the elderly woman hadn't made any real complaints. She had half expected a long list of special requests or complaints, but instead, the woman just sat there, eating peacefully and looking around the restaurant as if it was the nicest place she'd ever visited. Other customers were beginning to notice Emily's attitude, quietly observing how she served some tables with extra care and others, like this elderly woman, with cold indifference. A few exchanged glances, wondering if the woman would eventually say something or complain. But the elderly woman continued eating, entirely calm, seeming unaware of Emily's behavior. This calmness, somehow, only made Emily more irritable. She didn't like feeling judged, even if it was just in her own head, and she started to wonder why this woman didn't just leave if she wasn't happy with her table or service. Little did Emily know, this was no ordinary customer. The elderly woman's connection to the restaurant would soon change everything. And for Emily, her day was about to take a surprising and unforgettable turn. A rude welcome. Emily returned to her usual routine after seating the elderly woman, not giving her another thought. As she served other tables with bright smiles and cheerful small talk, her tone turned noticeably cold each time she returned to check on the elderly woman, Mrs. Williams. Mrs. Williams, for her part, remained calm and pleasant. She had chosen this restaurant for a reason. It held special meaning for her, though she hadn't been back in some time. She was patient, looking around the room with gentle curiosity as she waited. But when Emily finally returned to take her order, her demeanor changed to something less than friendly. "So," Emily said curtly, barely glancing up from her notepad, "what would you like to order?" Mrs. Williams smiled kindly, unfazed by the rudeness. "I'll have a cup of tea, dear, and perhaps a slice of that lovely lemon pie I saw on the menu." Emily frowned, muttering under her breath, "Seriously, just tea and pie?" She made a small, disapproving sound, then replied in a loud, sarcastic tone, "Is that all you're ordering?" Her voice carried across the room, drawing the attention of a few nearby diners. Mrs. Williams raised her eyebrows slightly, but kept her voice polite. "Yes, dear, that's all I'd like for now." Emily sighed dramatically. "Fine." She scribbled the order and left without a word, leaving Mrs. Williams sitting quietly, her smile never wavering. As Emily walked to the counter to place the order, she muttered to one of her coworkers, too loudly, "Some people just want to sit around for hours without spending much. Just a cup of tea and pie. What's the point?" Her coworker looked uncomfortable, glancing nervously at Mrs. Williams. "Emily, maybe you should be a little nicer. She seems harmless enough." Emily rolled her eyes, waving off the advice. "Harmless, maybe, but she's taking up space that could be for real customers," she scoffed. "And now she's acting all, I don't know, like she owns the place or something." She shook her head, then went to the kitchen, calling over her shoulder, "I'll take care of it. Don't worry." Back at her table, Mrs. Williams waited patiently, her eyes taking in the warm colors of the restaurant, the lively hum of conversations, and the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the windows. A nearby couple watched Emily's behavior with disapproval, whispering to each other about how rude the young waitress was being. But Mrs. Williams seemed untouched by the unpleasant attitude, enjoying the cozy ambience as though she were there for more than just a meal. When the tea and pie finally arrived, Emily practically dropped them on the table, barely stopping long enough to set them down properly. She gave a curt, "Here you go," without looking up, and then turned to leave. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Williams said gently, adding a touch of sweetness to her voice that only highlighted Emily's coldness. Emily ignored her, walking away with a huff, muttering again about how some customers could be so bothersome. Yet, through it all, Mrs. Williams remained calm, taking small sips of her tea and savoring each bite of her pie. Her gentle smile never left her face, even as Emily continued to ignore her, treating her like an inconvenience rather than a valued customer. A couple of tables over, Two young women who had witnessed the entire interaction whispered in disapproval. "Did you see how rude that waitress was?" One said to the other. "I can't believe she spoke to that elderly lady like that." The other nodded, frowning. "Yeah, it's awful. The poor woman just wanted some tea and pie. I wonder if she'll tell the manager." Emily, however, paid no attention to the murmurings of other customers. She had already labeled Mrs. Williams as just another troublesome patron, and she had no intention of doing anything more than the bare minimum to serve her. But while she tried to ignore the elderly woman, something about her presence began to gnaw at Emily. The woman's calm demeanor and quiet confidence made her feel almost uncomfortable, as if there was something Emily didn't know, something she should be careful about. Emily shook off the feeling, though, reminding herself that it was just another table, another low-paying customer, nothing to be concerned about. Little did she know, the truth about Mrs. Williams' connection to the restaurant would soon be revealed, and Emily's rude treatment of her would have consequences far beyond what she could have imagined. A surprising visitor. The day continued with the usual lunch rush, and Emily was too busy to pay much attention to Mrs. Williams, who remained seated by the entrance, sipping her tea slowly. Every now and then, Emily would glance over, expecting her to finish up and leave. But Mrs. Williams stayed put, calm and collected, her warm smile hinting at a quiet sense of purpose. As more customers filled the restaurant, one particular man caught the attention of everyone as he walked through the door. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit and looked both confident and approachable. His presence alone commanded respect. It was none other than Mr. Harrison, the owner of Bistro Haven, a detail that wasn't known to every customer but was well known among the staff. Emily froze for a second, her heart skipping a beat. Mr. Harrison wasn't one to make surprise visits, so his presence meant he was either inspecting the restaurant or addressing an issue. She quickly straightened up, forcing a bright smile and a polite tone she usually reserved for customers she wanted to impress. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison," she said with a sudden politeness, offering him a cheerful wave. "What brings you here today?" Mr. Harrison smiled back but seemed distracted, his eyes searching the room. "Hello, Emily," he replied warmly. "I'm actually here to meet a very special guest today." Emily blinked in surprise, glancing around. "Oh, I didn't realize we had any VIPs here today," she said, trying to sound casual. Mr. Harrison nodded, his gaze shifting to the elderly woman sitting by the entrance. His face softened instantly as he walked toward Mrs. Williams, who looked up and greeted him with a warm smile. "Mother," Mr. Harrison said gently, leaning down to give her a hug. "I'm so glad you made it." The affection in his voice was clear to everyone around them. Emily's eyes went wide. "Mother," she thought, staring in disbelief, quickly glanced away, trying to hide the embarrassment and shock that spread over her face. She hadn't expected this kind, quiet woman to be related to the owner, and certainly not his mother. Mrs. Williams smiled up at her son, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "It's wonderful to see you, dear. I decided to come in for a little surprise visit." Mr. Harrison chuckled, pulling a chair over to sit beside her. "I'm just happy you're here. Bistro Haven is always brighter when you visit." He turned to Emily, who stood nearby, looking stunned. "Emily," he called gently, noticing her hesitation. "Would you mind bringing us 2 coffees, please?" Emily managed a stiff smile and a quick nod. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. Right away." As she hurried back to the counter, her mind raced. How did I miss this? How could I have been so rude to the boss's mother? She felt a twist of panic as she prepared their coffees, realizing her earlier behavior might soon cost her more than just a tip. Meanwhile, at the table, Mr. Harrison and his mother chatted softly. Mrs. Williams didn't mention Emily's behavior, nor did she appear troubled by it. She was more focused on catching up with her son, sharing stories and laughter. Emily returned to the table, doing her best to act calm and composed. She placed the coffees down with extra care, keeping her gaze lowered to avoid meeting Mrs. Williams' eyes. "Here's your coffee, Mrs. Williams, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice unusually soft. Mrs. Williams gave her a kind smile, nodding politely. "Thank you, dear." Mr. Harrison took a sip of his coffee, nodding in satisfaction. "You know, Emily, it's always important to treat every customer well," he said, his tone casual but meaningful. "We never know who might walk in or who they might be connected to." Emily felt a wave of guilt wash over her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She nodded quickly, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes, Mr. Harrison," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I understand." But in her heart, she knew the lesson was a harsh one, and she could only hope that Mrs. Williams hadn't shared anything negative about her. For the rest of her shift, Emily remained on edge, aware that the woman she had dismissed and mistreated was no ordinary customer. As Mr. Harrison and his mother continued their conversation, Emily hovered nearby, watching them out of the corner of her eye. She could see their easy smiles, the gentle way they spoke, and the obvious warmth between them. And with every word, she felt her own shame deepen, knowing she had made a terrible mistake by judging someone based solely on appearance. And though Mrs. Williams hadn't said a single critical word, her quiet strength and kindness left a powerful impression on Emily, a reminder that respect and compassion should be shown to everyone, no matter who they were or how they looked. Little did Emily know, this was only the beginning. For in the days to come, the lesson she had learned would be tested, as the consequences of her actions slowly unfolded in ways she hadn't anticipated. The consequences begin. The next day, Emily arrived at work, her mind still reeling from the previous day's events. She couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Williams and how she had unknowingly disrespected the owner's mother. Her guilt weighed heavily, and every time she passed the table where Mrs. Williams had sat, a pang of regret surged through her. Emily noticed her coworkers glancing at her with curious expressions. She felt their eyes on her, sensing that word had spread about what happened. She tried to brush it off, busying herself with taking orders and serving tables, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Just as the lunch rush began, Mr. Harrison walked through the doors once again. He scanned the room, his gaze falling on Emily. Her heart skipped a beat as he approached her, a warm yet serious look in his eyes. "Emily," he began, his voice calm but firm, "could we have a quick chat in my office?" Emily's stomach twisted. She managed a small nod, her heart racing as she followed him through the bustling restaurant. When they reached his office, Mr. Harrison gestured for her to sit, and he took a seat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "I'm sure you know why I wanted to talk to you," he began, looking at her closely. "I spoke with my mother last night, and she mentioned her visit here." Emily's cheeks turned crimson, and she quickly lowered her gaze. "Mr. Harrison, I'm so sorry," she said softly, her voice filled with regret. "I didn't know she was your mother. I didn't know she was important." Mr. Harrison raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Every customer here is important, Emily. My mother didn't tell me about this to get you into trouble. In fact, she spoke very kindly about you, though she did mention that she sensed some frustration from you." Emily's face flushed deeper. I know. I shouldn't have treated her that way," she stammered. "I feel terrible about it. She was so polite, and I acted like she didn't matter." Mr. Harrison's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained serious. "My mother has a big heart, and she believes in giving people second chances, so I'm giving you the same opportunity, Emily." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I promise I'll do better," she said, relief washing over her. "I've learned my lesson." He nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I hope so." Bistro Haven is about treating people with respect and kindness. Remember that the next time you feel frustrated with a customer, everyone deserves to feel welcome here. Emily nodded quickly, her heart full of gratitude. She couldn't believe he was giving her another chance, and she was determined to make the most of it. As she returned to the floor, she found herself looking at each customer with fresh eyes, determined to be more patient and understanding. Her coworkers noticed the change in her demeanor, and a few even commented on how attentive she was being. But as the days went by, Emily began to sense something else in the restaurant, a subtle change in the air, as if the atmosphere itself had shifted. More customers started returning, requesting her service specifically. Word seemed to have spread about the helpful young waitress who had treated the owner's mother kindly, though Emily knew the reality had been quite different. She felt a mix of relief and irony, wondering if Mrs. Williams had been quietly vouching for her despite her earlier behavior. One afternoon, as Emily was taking a break, Mrs. Williams appeared in the restaurant again. She entered with a gentle smile, nodding politely to a few familiar customers who greeted her warmly. Emily felt her heart skip, nervous yet eager to make a better impression. This time, she approached Mrs. Williams with a genuine smile and a welcoming tone. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Williams," she said warmly. "It's wonderful to see you again. May I get you anything to start?" Mrs. Williams looked up, her eyes twinkling with kindness. "Thank you, dear," she replied, as if the previous encounter had never happened. "I'd love a cup of tea, please." Emily nodded, moving swiftly to prepare the tea. As she served it, she noticed a few other customers watching, murmuring softly and smiling at the scene. Word had spread quickly about the special guest, and they were eager to see how Emily would handle the interaction this time. As Mrs. Williams sipped her tea, she smiled up at Emily. "I see you've taken my son's words to heart. Thank you for the warm service today," she said, her tone gentle yet encouraging. Emily smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Williams. I'm so sorry for my behavior last time. I've learned a lot, thanks to you and Mr. Harrison." Mrs. Williams simply nodded, her smile warm and understanding. "It's never too late to learn, dear," she said softly, her words resonating deeply with Emily. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we grow from them." As Mrs. Williams finished her tea and prepared to leave, Emily felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing she had truly made amends. She watched as Mrs. Williams waved goodbye, the warmth and kindness in her eyes leaving a lasting impression on Emily. However, as she returned to her duties, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the lesson. For the first time, she understood the importance of treating every customer with respect, no matter who they were. And she vowed that, moving forward, she would carry this lesson with her, not just in the restaurant, but in every part of her life. A mysterious note. Days passed since Mrs. Williams' second visit, and Emily continued working diligently, treating every customer with newfound patience and respect. She was determined to prove herself, knowing that her actions were being observed by both Mr. Harrison and her coworkers. As she put her best foot forward, she felt as though a weight had lifted, until a small twist in her routine changed everything. It was a quiet afternoon, and Emily was tidying up tables after the lunch rush, when she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a water glass on one of the tables. It seemed odd. The paper was carefully placed, almost like it was waiting to be found. She glanced around, wondering if someone had forgotten it, but the table was empty. Curiosity got the best of her, and she unfolded the note. In neat handwriting, it read, "Emily, kindness is the true measure of success. Keep embracing it, even when no one's watching." Emily blinked, rereading the words. Her heart fluttered. Who could have left it? The handwriting didn't look familiar, and there was no signature. She glanced around, wondering if anyone was watching her reaction. The restaurant was quiet, and her coworkers were busy in other parts of the dining area. A sense of mystery filled her thoughts. Could this be from Mrs. Williams, or maybe Mr. Harrison? She couldn't say for certain, but the words felt deeply personal, as if someone knew the journey she'd been on and wanted to encourage her. She folded the note and slipped it into her apron pocket, feeling both curious and inspired. She went back to her tasks, but her mind kept drifting to the note. For the rest of the shift, Emily found herself smiling more often and going the extra mile to make customers feel comfortable and welcome. The note had left a small spark within her, and she didn't want to let it fade. Later that day, as she took a short break in the back, her coworker Clara joined her, a sly smile on her face. "Emily, you've been getting quite the attention lately," Clara teased, nudging her playfully. "Everyone's been talking about how much nicer you are to the customers." Emily chuckled, feeling slightly embarrassed. "I guess I just needed a little reminder," she replied, thinking about the mysterious note. Clara's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "I heard Mrs. Williams told Mr. Harrison that you've turned a new leaf. Word is, the boss is pretty happy with your work lately. Maybe you'll get a promotion soon." Emily's cheeks flushed, but she laughed it off. "Oh, I doubt that. I'm just glad to be given a second chance." Clara shrugged, but her expression softened. "Hey, second chances don't come around often, you know. Just keep doing what you're doing." As her shift ended, Emily found herself wondering more about the note and who might have left it. She thought of Mrs. Williams' gentle encouragement, Mr. Harrison's second chance, and the subtle ways they had helped her improve. As she locked up for the night and headed home, Emily realized that the note, mysterious as it was, had changed her outlook. No longer did she see each day as a routine. Instead, she saw an opportunity to connect, to show kindness, and to leave a lasting impression on the people around her, just as Mrs. Williams and Mr. Harrison had done for her. But deep down, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had left that note wasn't quite finished with their lesson, and that this newfound change in her was only the beginning. The unexpected visitor. The next day, as Emily arrived at work, she was greeted with an unusual sight. Mr. Harrison was standing near the entrance, engaged in a quiet conversation with a well-dressed woman. Her posture was dignified, and she radiated an air of confidence and authority. As Emily moved closer, she recognized the woman. Mrs. Williams, Mr. Harrison's mother. Emily's stomach fluttered with nervousness. Mrs. Williams noticed her approach and gave her a warm smile, which put Emily slightly at ease. She hadn't expected to see her again so soon, and certainly not in such a formal setting. "Good morning, Emily," Mrs. Williams greeted her kindly. "It's lovely to see you again." "Good morning, Mrs. Williams," Emily replied, smiling as politely as she could manage. "It's a pleasure to see you too." Mr. Harrison turned to Emily with a thoughtful look. "My mother has something she'd like to discuss with you, Emily, if you're willing to spare a moment." Emily nodded, a mix of anticipation and curiosity filling her. She couldn't imagine what Mrs. Williams might want to say, but she felt she had to seize this opportunity to make up for her past behavior. They led her to a quiet corner of the restaurant. Mrs. Williams sat down and gestured for Emily to join her, while Mr. Harrison observed quietly from the side. Emily sat, her nerves still tingling, and waited for Mrs. Williams to speak. "I've been watching you, Emily," Mrs. Williams began, her voice calm but firm. "And I must say, I'm pleased with the changes I've seen in you recently. You've shown kindness, respect, and genuine care toward our customers, and I wanted to acknowledge that." Emily felt a surge of pride and relief. "Thank you, Mrs. Williams. I've learned a lot since we first met," she said, her cheeks turning pink. "I owe much of that to you and Mr. Harrison for giving me a second chance." Mrs. Williams nodded. "It's good to recognize where we can grow. And because of your progress, I wanted to offer you an opportunity." She leaned in slightly, her gaze steady. "I'm working on a charity project that focuses on providing meals for seniors in need, and I think you would be a wonderful fit to help me with it." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected this at all. You want me to help with your charity?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Mrs. Williams confirmed, smiling warmly. "You have a talent for serving others, and I believe this project could benefit from your involvement. You'd be helping to organize and serve meals, bringing some of that warmth and care to people who often feel forgotten. Emily's heart swelled with emotion. She'd never thought of herself as someone capable of making a difference outside of her work, but here was an opportunity to do just that. "I would be honored, Mrs. Williams. I'll do my best to support your project," she promised, her voice filled with gratitude. Mrs. Williams nodded approvingly. "I believe you will, Emily. And don't worry, I'll be there to guide you along the way." Mr. Harrison stepped forward, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "We're proud of you, Emily. Remember, this is just the beginning. Keep growing, and don't forget the importance of every small act of kindness. You never know how deeply it can affect someone's life." Emily smiled, feeling both proud and humbled. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Thank you, Mrs. Williams. I won't let you down." As she returned to her duties, Emily's heart was light, and her spirit renewed. She was no longer the waitress who saw customers as routine. She was now a part of something bigger, something that reached beyond the walls of Bistro Haven. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this new opportunity came with its own challenges and lessons, and she felt ready to face them head-on, eager to prove to herself and others that she was capable of making a real difference. A new purpose. A week later, Emily joined Mrs. Williams at the charity's first event, a small gathering at a local community center. The place was bustling with elderly people from around the area, many of whom hadn't had a fresh, warm meal in days. Emily's heart went out to them as she watched their faces light up in anticipation. Mrs. Williams greeted Emily warmly. "I knew you'd show up early," she said with a smile. "Thank you for being here, Emily. Let's make today special for these people." Emily nodded, her heart pounding with excitement and a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. She put on an apron and got to work alongside other volunteers, preparing plates, serving meals, and making sure everyone felt seen and cared for. She moved from table to table, sharing small conversations, offering a kind smile, and making each person feel valued. As the event went on, Emily noticed Mrs. Williams watching her with a proud smile. During a brief lull in the activity, Mrs. Williams pulled her aside. "Emily," she began, "I've watched you grow into someone who brings warmth and kindness to those around her. I know it wasn't always easy, but you've embraced change in a way that inspires others, including me." Emily felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, Mrs. Williams. I didn't think I'd ever be someone who could make a real difference. You and Mr. Harrison saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself." Mrs. Williams reached out, placing a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "Sometimes we all just need someone to believe in us, to give us a chance to prove what we're capable of. You've done that, and more. I'm glad to have you as part of this project." As the evening drew to a close, an elderly gentleman approached Emily, holding her hand with surprising strength for someone his age. "Young lady," he said with a warm smile, "I don't know who you are, but thank you. Today reminded me that people still care." Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek. She smiled back at him, realizing that this was what she'd been searching for all along, a sense of purpose and connection that went beyond her job at the restaurant. That night, as she packed up and said her goodbyes to Mrs. Williams and the other volunteers, Emily felt a sense of fulfillment she'd never known before. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a person with a mission, someone capable of spreading kindness and making a difference in people's lives. When she returned to Bistro Haven the next day, she noticed her interactions with customers were different. Each smile, each conversation, held a deeper meaning. She no longer felt like she was just working the shift. She was building connections, one small act of kindness at a time. And while Emily didn't know exactly where this journey would take her, she knew she was ready to face it with a heart full of compassion, grateful for the second chance she'd been given. For the first time, she felt that she had not only found her purpose, but had also inspired others to do the same. The restaurant felt brighter, her role felt bigger, and Emily's life had transformed in ways she'd never thought possible.